bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So tonight, I'm going to be going through a piece called The Four Periods of Brazil's Black Rights Movement and Their Conquests. So I'm going to be focusing on, the Brazil's equivalent of like human and civil rights movement, representing the Black population and the demands of the Black population. I've said a lot over the years that, this movement has really provoked some change in Brazil in many ways, but in many ways, as the old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm really concerned about how the struggle is interpreted. Like, are there legitimate changes going on, or is it just the appearance of change? Because it's something that I see often going on in the United States. So naturally, as this is something that I've followed in Brazil for more than 2 decades now, I'm curious about how this is playing out in Brazil, and I've been following it, with my own analysis. It's like, my interpretation. Some people will agree with what I see, and other people will like, why are you a naysayer? Why are you a hater? And it's not that I'm a hater. It's just that I've seen some of the same things happen in Brazil that we've already seen happen in the United States since, arguably going back to the 1950s. Well, even further than that. But I'm going to present this as I go, and you'll understand why I mean that as I get into this article. So let's just jump straight into it. This is going to, like I said, is going to be more focused on what's going on with Black rights organizations in Brazil. Some of the periods in which these organizations and movements came about and where they are today. So again, the 4 periods of Brazil's Black rights movement and their conquests. Okay, a brief history of Black leadership, organizations, and struggle in Brazil. So let's just go get directly into this. So today I wanted to discuss a little history of Black Brazilian social movements that have fought against all forms of racial discrimination directed at Brazilians of visible African descent. Throughout the years that I have investigated the situation of the Black Brazilian, I and countless others, particularly, those of us coming from the United States who take an interest in the race situation in Brazil, we've often come to the conclusion that Black Brazilians are about 30 to 40 years behind a similar struggle of their cousins to the north, Black Americans. This is not to say that Afro-Brazilians have never organized or fought back, as Black Brazilian resistance has existed since arguably the beginning when 4 to 5 million Africans were transported to Brazil to work as slaves. There's something else I always like to point out is that, for African Americans, we're generally aware of the whole slave trade thing in the United States, but what I want other people to understand who have interest in the African diaspora, that Brazil received up to arguably 10 to 12 times more Africans shipped across the Atlantic to work as slaves than did the United States. Whereas generally it's an accepted figure that a little less than 400,000 Africans were shipped to the United States, whereas between 4 and 5 million were shipped to Brazil. So you see this this cross-Atlantic, would say slave trade that was going on between these countries in Africa and some of the ports of entry in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Pernambuco, which, is responsible for a sizable Black population in Brazil today. And I'm taking a position that it's just really difficult to be able to say how many Black Brazilians there are. It just depends on, what is your concept of Black? Because if you're somebody who says a Black person has to look exactly like someone from Africa, then you could say that, well, Brazil has a small Black population. But then again, we also have African Americans who would go to Africa and be like, well, you don't look like one of us. We can tell that you have some of us. You look somewhat like us, but the criteria between all the way, from Canada to the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, what is the correct criteria for what black is? That's why I'm not going to try to put a number on that. I think it's just, I don't think anybody will come to a conclusion about how many black people exist in Brazil or Venezuela or any other countries in South America and the Caribbean for that matter. So whether we consider the quilombos or maroon societies of the 17th century to today's activists on social networks, there has always been pushback on the part of Afro-Brazilians. When this comparison is made between Afro-Brazilian and African-American struggles, there are several things that must be considered. Black rights organizations have long existed in Brazil, but many of us studying the situation often wonder why it is that there was no mass movement of Black people in Brazil on the scale of a civil rights movement in the United States of the 50s and 60s. As the article below will show, Black Brazilian activism has always existed. It just never reached the level of participation as in the United States. So this is a popular photo from probably the 70s or 80s, and you can see the sign says 20 de Novembro, November 20th. It's the National Day of Black Consciousness is what it actually says, which is celebrated on November 20th every year. One key factor that I must point out, whether we discuss organizations such as the NAACP, all the way up to the Black Lives Matter movement, is that I've often noted that in movements that seem to be led by African Americans, there is usually what I call a hidden hand behind the scenes that leads and funds these organizations while presenting Black faces as the leaders of these movements. It's something that I noticed when I started checking out, documentaries about the civil rights movement, and you'll see these prominent figures placed in the front of the NAACP. So, they'll be Black men or whatever. But then when you find out years later, well, should the NAACP really be considered a Black organization? That's up for debate. You might be familiar with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others who have headed up the NAACP, but that's something that I question to this day. When I look at the NAACP and I think to myself, well, this organization is supposed to be for the advancement of colored people. And in many ways, the situation of African Americans in the United States is as bad as it was, 75, 80 years ago. It just depends on how you look at it. I mean, a lot of people tend to just look at prominent Black folks, your Oprahs and your Jay-Z's and the LeBron James of the world, and think, well, we've advanced, but as a people, have we really? Which makes me question, like, okay, what is the NAACP really doing? Have to ask that question. This question has come up again. I wonder how many of you may have watched the recent NAACP Image Awards. I'm not going to discuss that here, but I just have to ask, when you see what went on there, you just have to ask, okay, does this organization still represent the African American struggle? This is what I say when we start mixing the movement of African Americans and our flag issues, and then you get other issues that come, that they'll put under, our movements. So I have to ask that, like, okay, if you saw that last award show, what came to your mind? Anyway, let me keep this moving. So, Marcus Garvey versus the NAACP, particularly the beef that he had with W.E.B. Du Bois is something that's well known in Black history. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to be somebody who's presented to us as one of our greatest leaders or whatever. But you just have to ask the question when you find out what W.E.B. Du Bois was all about, his views on socialism. And then you look at what Marcus Garvey, and not only W.E.B. Du Bois, but the organization that he was a part of for so many years. And again, this is another example of having a Black face at the head of the organization, while it's not necessarily Black people pulling the strings of this organization. So, and you have to ask, well, if we're not running this organization, is it really ours? Marcus Garvey came to his own conclusions. That's why Garvey and W.B. Du Bois had their, they had their beef going for years. Anyway, so as I said, Marcus Garvey discovered this when he made contact with the founders and leaders of the NAACP way back in the 1920s. Just, to Garvey, it's like, this is not really a Black organization. Look at the leadership behind the scenes. I've always said, if your movement or organization is founded, led, and or funded by people outside of your group, it is not, in fact, your movement. And this applies to numerous so-called Black organizations when you really look at it. Then, I mean, how can we talk about this and not talk about Black Lives Matter? Because I see the same formula being repeated time after time, and Black folks put their hopes and dreams and emotion behind these organizations, not realizing like they're not really ours. You have to look behind the scenes. You have to look at the funding and say, okay, are these organizations really something that's looking out for the aspirations of the Black population, or are these organizations fronts that use Black people for other agendas? I'll leave that for you to consider. I've already, I've come to this conclusion myself. This is what I come to find for years. Now, when I say that Black Lives Matter, when I said that Black Lives Matter was a sham several years ago, people condemned me because they didn't know what was really going on, or because they didn't really know where to look. So when it was exposed that BLM had taken in tens of millions of dollars, people were genuinely shocked, especially when they discovered where much of this funding went. I wasn't shocked at all. Since BLM was taken over from its grassroots leaders, the Black Lives Matter movement soon showed all the earmarks of being a sham. And that's the position that I still hold to this day. If you feel like you can show me otherwise, just let me know, because all of the people who are, branch organizations of Black Lives Matter across the country, you've been hearing about these groups saying, where's our money? Where's our support? But yet you see Black Lives Matter, particularly the leaders, living these lavish lifestyles, and having these huge homes. What's really going on? So, when I said that a few years ago, people looked at me like I was just out of my mind. But when you see the same pattern going on with Black organizations, Black leadership, I mean, seriously, if you go all the way back to like Frederick Douglass, you come up through the NAACP, the Urban League, and all of these organizations, you just have to ask, okay, if they're supposed to be leading us to an improvement of the Black population and the Black community, what's going on? Who's pulling the strings behind these organizations? Where's the money coming from? Because that will explain to you why we continue to be in the same situation that we're in. Anyway, this is a screenshot of a news report of all Black Lives Matter Solidarity March. Not sure what city it was in, but I'm just saying, look at all of these people. When you look at a lot of the mass movements that have happened in not only the United States, but you remember the Arab Spring some years ago, you remember, Occupy Wall Street. You saw that enormous movement that went down in Brazil. I think it was 2013 or 14 or so. And, it popped up just like that, and it disappeared just as quickly. You have to ask yourself, what was really going on there? So when we look at the television and see tens or hundreds of thousands of people marching on the street seemingly out of nowhere, that takes funding and engineering. And like other mass protests and movements across the world that we've seen in the 21st century, this all looked too familiar. What I've noticed with Brazil's modern day Black rights movements is that there seems to be a lot of money being tossed around these days that simply didn't exist in the 1930s and the 1970s Black rights endeavors. In the 1970s, many Afro-Brazilians didn't trust any sort of funding from external sources, with some Black Brazilian organization funding coming from the leadership itself. Now, I was reading this piece where they were, interviewing some leaders within what's called the Movimento Negro, the Black rights organizations, collectively known as the Movimento Negro, and they were just very suspicious of funding sources that were coming out of outside of Brazil. This particular activist talked about how he felt that this was, I think he said he thought that the funding was like coming from the CIA in the United States, and he thought that was dangerous. Then there's the story of this very important cultural leader, how can we say, he's just a very important figure in documenting the history of Afro-Brazilian culture. This guy named Filó. I've run into Filó a number of years. He's based in Rio de Janeiro. I think he's him and his partner, Carlos Medeiros, who's a well-known journalist, they've been in the struggle documenting, Black cultural history for a number of years, all the way back to the 70s. And it was intriguing because Filaw talked about, this is Filaw and Carlos Medeiros back in the 70s. Obviously, they look a little bit different now. Here it is, 40, 50 years later. And Filaw talked about how he was snatched up off the street by Brazil's the intelligence arm of Brazil's government, and he was interrogated and psychologically tortured. And they were looking at him like, okay, negão, Black man, where is the $1 million that you got from the United States? Because they were afraid that Filaw and others in these at the time they were organizing these Black dances. A lot of Black Brazilians really got attached to Black soul and funk music coming out of the United States in the 70s. And so they were afraid that this guy would have the influence to start a Brazilian branch of the Black Panthers. So they wanted to make sure that that wouldn't happen. So so Dom Filaw, the government thought that he was getting these huge donations from the United States to start up the Black Panthers. Where's that money? And then the other guy who was interviewed talked about this. He thought that he didn't want to get involved in any external funding for the Movimento Negro because he thought it might, might have the fingerprints of the CIA on it, and he didn't want to get involved in that. So, anyway, let me see, where are we now? Okay, so this is what I'm saying. So one of my conclusions that I'm coming to is that in the 1970s, probably the 1930s, you just didn't get a whole lot of funding for these organizations. When you get mass movements that you saw like going on during the civil rights movement in the United States, it takes money to support that. It takes money if, you're going to be marching from Alabama and next thing you know, you take the movement up to Chicago. I mean, it takes money and organizational skills to make something like that happen. And so, my hunch was correct. It's like in the 1970s, you just didn't have that much funding in Black Brazilian organizations, right? So this is one of the leading NGOs in Brazil called Guedes, the Black Women's Institute. And they've been at the forefront of a lot of, they have a great website that, does day-to-day updates talking about what's going on with Black Brazil. And this is an organization of Black women. So starting in like the late 80s, they started getting funding for their organization. So that's what I'm saying. By the late 80s and the start of the 1990s, there was a sudden boom in funding for Black organizations, particularly the NGOs. As Professor Edward Telles tells us, the Ford Foundation became the biggest financial supporter of Movimento Negro organizations and racial relation research in Brazil. And, this comes to my mind because when I first started studying this stuff back in like late 1999 and really going into the first 6 months of the 2000s, I remember being in college and these Black oriented websites were popping up, Black Brazilian websites were popping up talking about the racial situation. It was just a plethora of information that was coming out, which pushed me to learn a little bit more of Portuguese so I could read some of this stuff. But with the explosion of the internet, it's like the discussion of Black Brazilians has exploded in the last 20 years. It's a little bit different than what was going on in the 70s and even the 80s with, obviously a lot of funding is coming in, a lot of organizations being, is coming in. Then you have a lot of training of leadership. This is something I want to explore more, but I'm going to keep going with this piece. But this tells me a lot of what I wanted to know. Soon after, Crioula is another Black women's organization in Brazil, another NGO, what they call ONGs, is ONG versus NGO in English. Soon after, the MacArthur Foundation also got involved, becoming the second largest financial supporter of Black-oriented movements in Brazil. In the period since then, it should be noted the rise of a number of prominent organizations led by Afro-Brazilian women. Besides American support, I also must point out the financial support of multinational companies as well as the Brazilian government. Now, this is not to say that all organizations of the Movimento Negro were suddenly flush with money, as many continue to experience financial difficulties, a situation pointed out by Brazilian sociologist Florestan Fernandes in the 1960s. When I think of this situation, I think of the difficulties experienced by the historically important Bloco Afro. It's one of these. Bloco Afro. These are the organizations, the groups that participate in the Carnival every year. And one of the first and one of the most prominent was called Ileaye. They're still very important Bloco to these days. To the current day, I would say this is an early picture of some of the men in the Ileaye Bloco. So what I was saying, Ileaye for last few years, as I've seen, they've been running into some financial difficulties, right? So this makes me wonder why some organizations seem to be doing fine while others go through hard times. I have my ideas and suspicions, but I won't assert any assumptions until I gather all of the facts at this point. In the last decade or so, I have to admit and have noticed numerous advances made by Black Brazilians that cannot be ignored. But I must also share my point of view that much of all of this is just like for show. Because the point is, similar to what I see in the US, you're going to have a X amount of number of prominent Blacks who move up the social ladder, while the masses are still struggling to get by. Where have we seen that? Of course, we know what era this comes out of. We know who this guy is in the middle. So let us not forget that a fortune has been spent to organize mass protests, marches, etc., for African Americans since the 1950s. But here we are in the 21st century, and regardless of a number of prominent Black individuals, African Americans as a group are in some ways worse off than we were before the start of the civil rights movement, through Black Power and right up to Black Lives Matter. With this in mind, what does this say about plans in Brazil, considering that some of the same tactics are being adapted for Afro-Brazilians? So here you have Dr. King on one of the numerous marches that he, participated in when he was alive. Then you have this march in Rio de Janeiro in 1983, with people like Abdias do Nascimento, Benedita da Silva, a longtime politician. A woman came from a poor background in a Rio favela. You've got Lelia Gonzalez, one of the most important Black female anthropologists back in the 80s and 90s. Looks like a very similar scene that, we're accustomed to seeing in documentaries about the civil rights movement, but this is Rio in 1983. I mean, we've had affirmative action and quotas in the US for the past few decades. We've had them in Brazil. We've seen investments from the political left in Black organizations in the US and increasingly in Brazil. So, I'm gonna get into this right here. What does this banner mean? Vidas negras importam. Anybody care to translate? Let me move on. We've seen the rise of Black Lives Matter in the US. Then we saw the same slogan imported into Brazil under the exact same translation in Portuguese, which said Vidas negras importam, which means Black Lives Matter. Not to mention seeing Black Lives Matter's leadership visiting and participating in Black protests in Brazil. We've seen the Black left's politics in the US become almost totally intertwined with feminism and LGBT, and we see the same thing happening in Brazil to this day. With this in mind, I have to ask, if the same things are being done, should we really expect a different result? I'll leave that for you to decide, but for now, let's get into today's article, okay?